And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi everyone, this is Meteorologist Joel Curtis with your marine weather, issued Wednesday, January 15th. Starting out with our sea ice edge, we're taking a look at the southwestern portion of the analysis. There is expecting just a slight retreat of the ice as these weather systems start to move up the west coast and bring a little bit warmer air with them. Also, Cook Inlet still has a little bit of ice, as well as Kamishak Bay and just a little bit in Bristol Bay as well. So, for Wednesday's weather, we've got a low pressure system in southeast Alaska. That's the one that's been generating some wind. Arctic high pressure is starting to build over the central interior, about 1026 millibars. Weak little low up toward St. Matthew. That one's about 1010 millibars. And then our Comer, the low that's going to be really making a change in the pattern, 978 well south of the western Aleutians. This is what it looks like Thursday. So that low splits up into two centers, but still fairly deep, about 978 millibars or so. In other words, another weak low, about really 1018 up by Wrangel Island. And then the Arctic high pressure is really starting to surge into the Yukon territory, about 1042, pretty strong high. Expect a little bit of outflow wind with that, but that's also got to deal with, too, the other high that's south of the Gulf, about 1034 millibars or so. So looking at our southeast Alaska Thursday marine forecast, northwesterlies on the backside of the low, about 10 to 20 knots on the outside. Seas running up all the way up to about 14 feet or so, good westerly fetch there. And then on the inside waters, variable directions, about 15 knots, and seas up to 3 feet, 7 feet for Clarence Strait. And then for Friday, now we start to see that it responding to that front that's moving up. 25 knot small craft advisory off of Cape Suckling, seas up to 13 feet, but ramping down to about 15 to 20 knots or so along the rest of the outside waters. Seas up to about 12 feet with a residual swell that's probably out of the southwest. In the meantime, on the inside waters, northerlies ranging 15 to 25 knots and seas up to 4 feet. For the south central waters, some variable wind directions on the outside, ranging anywhere from about 10 to 20 knots, seas up to 7 feet, some residual swell there. Prince William Sound, northerlies 15 knots, seas 3 feet. And then for Cook Inlet, 10 to 15 knots, seas up to 4 feet until you get down to Kennedy Entrance, which is variable directions because of the low approaching, but then 25 knots small craft advisory and seas 5 feet. Then on Friday, things really start to respond to that far western low. So we're starting to see small craft advisory winds ranging from about 25 knots over by Cape Suckling on up to 40 knots as you get out toward the Barren Islands, seas 12 feet there. 20 knots easterlies in Prince William Sound, seas up to 4 feet. 15 to 20 knots in Cook Inlet. And then when you get down to off Seldovia or so, easterlies 40 knots, gale force, and seas up to about 11 feet. And then for our Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island waters, winds are already starting to ramp up with feeling that low that's moving up. Winds 25 all the way up to 40 knots as you get further south from Chillicothe Strait down to off of False Pass, 40 knots. Seas there are about 17 feet, and now the swell is coming around to south for that area. And then on the Bering Sea side, gale, 35 to 40 knots, and seas up to about 6 feet or so. Not a lot of fetch there. Then on Friday, we've got gale force on the Pacific and Gulf side, 35 to 40 knots, 30 knots for Chillicothe Strait, seas 8 feet, but up to 16 and 17 feet the further south you get with a southeasterly fetch. And then on the Bering Sea side, gale force, 35 to 40 knots, and seas up to about 6 feet. For the Aleutians, we've got a lot of response to that low that's coming up. On the Pacific side, we've got 40 knots down south of Unalaska, seas up to about 19 feet. Still a lot of swell out there left over from the storms that we've been having. But then as you go across seas roughly 18 to 19 feet, but not a whole lot of wind, 15 to 20 knots or so. Then on the Bering Sea side, we've got a real wide variety of wind speeds. A few places where 35 knots ramping up to 40 knots, seas 10 feet without a lot of fetch distance. But off of Shimia there, seas up to 17 feet in the northeasterlies. And then on Friday, what we've got is now responding to that low. It's moved up into the Bering Sea, so a lot of southerly component on the wind. On the Pacific side, winds ranging from 15 to 30 knots. Seas will be up as high as about 15 feet or so, maybe 16 off of Unalaska. And then on the Bering Sea side, a little bit more variation in wind direction. Westerlies, because it's on the backside of the low, out in the western Aleutian areas, seas up to 15 feet, 30 knots. And then on the eastern section, as you get closer to that front, 30 knots out of the south and seas 6 feet with not a lot of fetch. So for the west coast, we got plenty of gales going on. As you get up from the Pribilofs, about easterlies 40 knots, seas 15 feet, 30 knots off of St. Matthew. And then as you get further north, you're out of that pressure gradient from that low pressure system, so roughly 15 to 25 knots over the ice. And then as we get into Friday, plenty of gales in the easterly sections of about southeast 40 knots, seas up to 6 feet, still not a lot of fetch distance to gin up that sea. But for the Pribilofs, 25 knots out of the southeast, and St. Matthew, easterlies 35 knots and seas up to 16 feet, where you've got some fetch distance in there. But now over the ice, 25 to 30 knots as you move further north. And then for the Arctic coast, through the Bering Strait, starting out on Thursday, 15 to 20 knots or so. And then as we get up off of Cape Lisburne, about 25 knots. And then along the further north along the Chukchi and the Beaufort Sea, easterlies 15 knots. And then for Friday, ramping up to 20 knots along the Arctic Ocean. But then as we get down toward the Bering Strait, we could see some gale force, 35 knots easterlies. And then as we get further south, out of the pressure gradient of that low pressure system, easterlies generally 30 knots. And where you can get some sea, it'll be pretty light. And so that's it for our marine forecast. Please let somebody know if you're going out, and please be safe out there. Thank you.